Hi everyone,
Hello.
welcome to our webinar on how to use the business model canvas to build great products and services. We chose this topic based on the results of a poll at the end of our last webinar on personas. It's what you guys asked for. It's a really interesting topic for us because aside from being a great tool to capture the rationale behind the business of an idea, it also facilitates a number of other things. So we're going to focus the webinar on a few topics. We're going to look at how you can use the canvas for ideation, validation, and communication. If those two words don't mean anything to you now, we guarantee that they will do by the end of this webinar, and at the end we'll be answering your questions too. Before we do go any further, it's worth probably reintroducing ourselves. We've seen a lot of you on the previous webinars, but there's a lot of new names too. So if you haven't met me before, my name's Mark. I develop courses and content for VFQ, as well as consult for emergence clients. I love thinking about business models and how they can be changed in the face of consumer trends and different movements in the market.
I'm Pedro. I'm also a product developer with Emergent. I focus mostly on product management and innovation. You can find more about us at VFQDev or at valleyfallquality.com, where you can also find our blogs and our courses and all of the good content that we produce. As Mark mentioned, during this webinar, we'll be talking about business models, a business model canvas, and the lean canvas. So I'm kind of talking about both of them, and obviously about the different ways of using it and how it can be used for ideation, to validate assumptions, and to be better in terms of how you communicate with colleagues and stakeholders.
Yeah, I think it's worth noting that the webinar is only an introduction to the capabilities of the tool. And so whilst we'll provide some examples, there's a lot more depth to it than is possible to cover in the 20 minutes we've got scheduled. So I would say sign up to our newsletter. I would say read our blogs, because that's where we really explore these types of tools and explain a bit more about how you can get to grips with them.
So quick overview on the business model canvas. Business models have been around for a long time, but they are predominantly been used in the form of a business case. So if you work in larger enterprises, you basically have a business case that asks you what are you doing, how are you going to do it, and what profit will you make, and asks you for a lot of technicalities and a lot of in-depth descriptions of how it works. Most of us have been doing it or exposed to it, and we know that it's typically a bloated document with dozens or hundreds of pages, and it is many times filled with assumptions that we think are facts or that we try to pass on as facts. But the fact is that these cause problems when we treat them like that, because if they're wrong, it means wasted capital or even a false sense of security. So canvases are an alternative to business cases when it comes to quickly both develop and discuss business models. And yes, the business model canvas was initially mostly used by startups, but it's also a better way of thinking and working through your business models. And companies like GE, Procter & Gamble, and Nestle, they've been using it, and these are just examples of companies using these kinds of tools.
They're really effective in helping visualize the hypotheses and assumptions that you're making about your business, the business model, and the business case that underpins your idea, but they can do much more, and that's why we're discussing them today. So just as a point of note, there are sort of two really popular canvases out there. On the left, you can see the business model canvas, and on the right, an adaptation of it called the lean canvas. They both capture similar information, and lots of people think they're interchangeable, but if we take a look at the similarities to start with, they both cover aspects of context, which includes competition and partnerships. They both look at value proposition design, so the actual product or service that you develop. They look at customer research. They look at the channels through which you deliver your product or service, and the economics that underpin them. But the difference is, and perhaps the easiest way to summarize them, is that whilst the lean canvas takes quite a problem and customer-centric, solution-led approach in the detail of it, the business model canvas takes a much higher and strategic level view. So quite often you'll find organizations using the lean canvas in a product or feature setting, whereas they'll use the business model canvas to describe things that perhaps involve more strategic level concerns. I guess we're all thinking this is all well and good, but what else can you do with the canvas? And that's what we're going to break into now.
Yeah. So one of the things obviously is use the business model canvas not as a tool to develop business models, but as a tool to ideate around and to think around. Because the business model canvas gives you a holistic view, it captures really well the context and allows you to easily build in constraints, which are key elements to start ideating and having new ideas. So with such a high-level view, it should be fairly straightforward to think about like new untapped customer segments, new channels, and just by creating this environment. And we'll look into that, so how this is done. If you look at an aspect, if you look at a business model and you simply think, what if, right? And this what if basically means changing the main premise of a business model. And we can think about an airline. Before Southwest Airlines, most business models in airlines were mainly focused around the same thing, and the cost structure was pretty much the same, and they were not really profitable. Southwest Airlines, what they did was just rethink the cost structure, and by rethinking the cost structure, by asking what if we don't have things like meals, and remove partnerships with travel agencies, what happens to our cost structure and how does that impact the remaining of the business model? So by focusing on changing one aspect of the business model, the cost structure, that allowed to create a completely new offering. The same we can see the same with Disney, which was basically they asked, what if you don't use televisions to entertain fans? And that creates theme parks, that creates music, that creates a lot of different offerings that Disney has developed. And obviously, this doesn't mean that Southwest Airlines and Disney are using the business model canvas, but this shows you how the reasoning can be created using the business model canvas.
I mean, what we're getting at here, and again, we're bringing up the example of a low-cost airline, is that although each of the boxes on the canvas is quite small, the thinking that could and should go into each one of them can allow you to develop a new business model or a new competitive edge. So the impact of changing your cost structure actually means that your value proposition changes. So, you know, your flight now becomes a no-frills experience. Your channels might change, so you might sell through the web rather than travel agents. And your customer segments change, so you might end up selling to budget travelers rather than the business travelers that predominated in the earlier years. So just by taking one box and exploring that and looking at the insights that develops, you know, even if you took the customer segments, there's a whole load of research that goes into that, and that's where obviously we spoke about personas in our last webinar. The product of this is just new ideas, and new businesses have emerged in the past few years that attack the incumbents and introduce consumers to a new way of buying content, or at least licensing it in the case of Spotify.
Second bit.
So the second point here is all about validation, and this is the second concern that we wanted to address today. This is when putting down all your assumptions about a business model and a product into one canvas can actually start surfacing more detail than you realize. So now you've visualized those assumptions, you might think, well, what was the point in writing all these things down? What was the point in having a business model if it's just full of things that aren't actually true? It's a good question, but with the canvas, at least you're a step ahead of everybody else. You probably visualized your assumptions, and in that context, you're then able to start thinking, well, which are my riskiest ones? So the idea here is to get everything out there that underpins the business model, and then list out which are the most difficult ones to actually prove or validate, and go after them with experiments. So by systematically validating the assumptions on your canvas, you can prove each and every aspect of your business model, how that's going to work, and you can choose the ones that you're going to attack first.
And this is a really easy tool to highlight and share assumptions, making them visible, and even to kind of highlight different risk factors and which ones are the highest risk. So, and also allows you to look at in which areas you need to run your experiments to kind of validate or disprove the assumptions that you have. So in this example, we have around customer segment or around revenue streams. So it's where you have to use this as a kind of a checklist where you go box by box and segment by segment and understand how can I experiment around this and how can I prove that my assumption is right. So build your business model canvas, identify your assumptions, and then build experiments to validate.
I think that's a really important point, and I don't think we should underemphasize it, that businesses are pretty bad at going back on their business cases and proving that they achieved the results that they said they would. The canvas is designed to be a living document that actually changes and is updated over time. And so by closing the loop on an assumption that your adoption rate would be 20% in the first month, you're able to actually judge your own success and appraise whether or not your investment is worth continuing to pursue.
And because it's dynamic, as you generate more answers to your assumptions, maybe there are other assumptions that surface from that, and you can use this as a way of communicating with everyone and showing where you need to work a little bit more to make sure they have a sound business model. So, and you can do a lot of things, just like price, testing with price and how you can validate that, right? Just by having an MVP or a prototype that it's out there and you can have customers interact. And how does that impact revenue streams? How does that impact customer segments? So the business model should be something that you look at holistically as well. And finally, the third bit, which is around communication, using the business model canvas for communication. The business model canvas might not be the document that you want to take to your senior stakeholder when you're presenting your final request for funding or for support on your idea, because they might need a little bit more than that. But it's a great tool for you to start the conversations and to have the right conversations with the right people. And this is mainly because of two things, right? Because the business model canvas touches in the most important parts of how you build a business at a high level, obviously, and it promotes a discussion and feedback because it's such a simple and lightweight format that it becomes easier for everyone to understand, even people that are not doing business cases for a living, right? It's really a really good collaboration tool. So it's really useful to also to articulate ambition, for example, or just how is your business model right now, and show it to peers or stakeholders. It can also be something where you just establish your vision for the product or for the business.
On this point of communication, it's quite interesting that the business model can help you pitch a whole idea. And so the canvas itself is a very important tool here. As you can see on the left-hand side, we've got a pitch structure. So what problem are you trying to solve? And that's covered by the value proposition or indeed the problem statement that's captured on the lean canvas. How are you doing it? Well, that's your key activities and your channels. And thirdly, how does it impact the company? Well, that's your revenue streams and obviously the costs involved in doing that. Remember at the start of this webinar, Pedro said, tell me what you're going to do. That's your value proposition. How you're going to do it. That's the channels and key partners. And what profit you'll make. That's the profit structure. Think about how this would work with a business case. You know, if somebody asks you, how do you intend to make money from this idea? What's the return on this product? What's the return on this feature? You flick through a few pages of a document, you try to join a few data points up, and you say, well, this is how. Whereas the canvas, because of its literally flat structure and one-page design, it's really easy to talk around, and it's really easy to discuss how the different parts of the business model relate to one another. It is a tool that's designed for conversation. And it's also great, as we've already emphasized, to quickly iterate on through discussion and feedback. it's cheap to tear up and start a new one or make some adjustments and add new pieces to it. People that have a really good understanding of a problem and how to structure a business model could fill one of these out in 20, 30 minutes, which is great. But even more powerfully is that you could spend days, hours afterwards inspecting each element and designing experiments to test the assumptions and validate your business model with real data. The point here is that all these three things are things that you wouldn't necessarily think of doing with a business model canvas. It's not a replacement tool, as quite often people try and run into organizations and lead with, saying, well, we don't need to do business cases anymore, we just need to run the business model canvas. It's actually a tool that you can use to, one, ideate around new business models or iterations of business models, two, to validate your assumptions with experiments, so having an experimental approach is key here, and three, to communicate and collaborate with your peers and customers to build better products and services. So more than just a sheet of paper, you can use the business model canvas to change the way you work from a process perspective, but also the way that you work and interact with your colleagues and other stakeholders too.
So this was in terms of going through the business model, all that we wanted to cover for today. We have now time for a couple of questions. There's a couple that we see coming in already. So Mark, do you?
Yeah, so the first one is, how do I start using a business model canvas? I think the first thing to say there is that there isn't a simple answer to this question. Fundamentally, the business model canvas and the lean canvas are both a single piece of paper, and there's only a limited amount of information that you can capture on them. There's lots of advice, Pedro, right?
Yeah. So I generally recommend as a first pass to start looking at it. Just start trying to fill one with everything that you know and what you understand about your product or business, and try to identify the biggest risks that you have there. Also, we advocate that you should try to search for feedback from people that can help you build a little bit more on the understanding that you currently have, and from there iterate and see what risks do you still have, what assumptions do you still have. Those things will help you have a clear view of how your business is currently structured and help you communicate with other people on how to improve it.
Is there a specific order you think that we should fill the canvas out in?
Yeah, so generally, if you're creating something new, I would leave the part on the revenue stream and cost structure to the end, and the only reason is because it can limit your creativity if you're thinking about, well, I only have X amount of money to solve a problem, so try to solve it first without thinking about costs, and then after that put in the constraints that will help you to still get to the same way of solving it, but maybe it needs some tweaks, it needs use of different technology. Maybe instead of AI, it's just a person on the other side of the computer, but think about the solution first and the cost structure after.
Okay, I mean, it's worth noting that the business model canvas or the lean canvas aren't tools that should just be used in isolation. So you need to think about the other tools and techniques of product management to make sure that you're building great products and services, which are customer research, which helps you fill out the customer problem and the value proposition part of it. Equally, prototyping, metrics for success, experimentation, all these things are really important, and they're activities that should be driven out of using the canvas. Another question we have here is, how do I get feedback on my business model canvas? Well, I think it's worth noting that feedback drives quality, right? So we're big fans of feedback here at BFQ. We would encourage you to share your canvas with peers, with colleagues, and that way they can provide feedback and ask questions about some of the assumptions that you might have made in your business model. You might have to answer questions like, how much data do you have on the customer problem? Have you identified your early adopters? Why do those metrics matter? And what's your value proposition? And if you can't answer some of these questions to begin with, that's fine. It's just worth knowing where the uncertainty lies and how you can address it. Over time, You should be able to build more robust and solid answers to these questions backed up by real data. I did say peers and colleagues are great people to help you get feedback on the business model, but the only way to understand whether or not your business model works is by actually how the market reacts to your product. So the customer data is probably the one that gives you the most validation there. Another question was, nobody in my company currently uses a canvas like the lean canvas or the business model canvas. Is this still useful?
Yeah, for sure. So one thing that we notice whenever we are with a client or a member of a team wants to start using it is that it makes communication much easier. So other people actually start asking questions and wanting to use it as well, just because everything flows way easier whenever you're discussing a business model. So I would start using it, but mainly as a communication tool, because that's the low-hanging fruit, and it makes it creates less resistance. And to start using for the other purposes is a little bit harder. But generally, the advice is, use new tools and introduce it to the organization, and you will see that the resistance is lower than you would expect.
So there's an interesting question here. I find resistance in offering canvases to senior stakeholders in place of the traditional business case. How do I build trust?
So it's a good one. I think we addressed a little bit of it during the session. I wouldn't completely replace it. I would have it as a conversation starter and something to build upon. The final document will probably need to be a business case, and most companies will request for a business case with product specs and everything that needs to go in. But as a starting point, the business model canvas is probably easier. So don't use it as a replacement. Use it as a stepping stone on developing a business model and thinking through it, and just like making it more visible to everyone what you're thinking is.
I think, as I would advise when introducing any new tool, and as you've just said, Pedro, is you actually have to build trust and show them that it actually has some meaning, some value. It drives useful conversations, great. It drives new ideas, great. It helps you validate and visualize your assumptions, fantastic. But until you've done that, I'd be very wary of saying, well, let's just replace our entire process with that. That isn't to say it's not better than a lot of things out there. It's just to say people won't trust it. And so if you have a trust issue, that comes down to change management and getting some buy-in on that as well.
Do you have any more? So could you give an example of using the business model canvas in real estate? I will assume that this is around real estate agencies. There's a lot of things that we've seen lately in the past years on even startups just changing the way things are done, right? Even there's a company called Uniplaces, and I know for a fact that they've used the business model canvas, and what they've done is they created a marketplace for renters and for university students, and they just basically use the business model canvas to start thinking through their business model and how to create where the channels would be, how the experience should be, what is the value prop. Giving you a specific example of a business model canvas of a real estate agency, or we don't have any of those with us, but I'm happy to talk through it if you want to in the near future.
Yeah, I think in the idea generation space, that is where you can think of disruptive business models. So you can take a look at current business models and figure out, as Southwest Airlines, how do you completely upend the cost structure or minimize the costs to then and how does that impact the service and the customers that you serve. It's certainly a good way of using it to generate ideas. That's all the questions that we have. Oh, here we go. One more question. I nearly closed out early. So would you recommend it for smaller products from an investment perspective? It's a very good question, and I think certainly in large organizations, the less that you're asking for in terms of investment, perhaps less detail and rigor that people are expecting in having to win that money over. So, asking for a smaller amount of money, do you need to build as much trust as if you're asking for a multi-million-pound investment? I'm not sure you could describe everything you need to about a multi-million-pound investment on a single page.
Probably not.
And I would definitely say that you'd be able to use it to drive conversations, but not necessarily to reassure people that their investment is sound. And that is where the traditional business case and a plan and a roadmap and all those other good things come into play to make sure that you are developing the right things. So it's a tool. I don't think it's to be used in isolation, and I don't think it's to be used to replace anything completely and copy it.
Yeah, as we mentioned, it is a way of thinking through a business model, both creating a new one and generating new ideas, or for communicating easier, or to understand what needs validating still, and how we can tweak it. But again, it's hard in many organizations. It will be hard to completely replace a traditional business case with a business model canvas. But again, it's a really good way of starting discussions. And as Mark was saying, for smaller things, a business model canvas is probably more than enough to get the buy-in of a stakeholder.
I think that's a great question, and I think it's something that we could explore in a future webinar, which is how do I introduce new tools and techniques to my organization, and how do I win trust with them?
Definitely. Thank you so much for attending. See you soon.
Yeah, thanks, guys. Thanks for listening.
Thank you.